The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Welcome to today's webinar, Age-Friendly Communities in Rural America, the Transportation Challenge. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. When you joined today's webinar, you selected to join either by phone call or computer audio. If for any reason you would like to change your selection, you can do so by accessing your audio pane in the control panel. You have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenters by typing your questions into the questions pane of the control panel. And you may send your questions in at any time. We will collect these and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. I would now like to introduce John Feather, CEO of Grantmakers in Aging and moderator for today's event. John?
Thank you, Kat. I'm delighted that over 400 of you have joined us today. GIA is continuing our series of webinars designed to encourage greater philanthropic engagement in age-friendly efforts across the country. And the objective of this series is to bring attention to the topics and issues that relate to age-friendly community efforts and the challenges that such communities face. GIA is also committed to building a national network for rural aging through the efforts of its Rural Aging Initiative. Before we start, I want to thank the John A. Hartford Foundation, which supports this series throughout the year and makes it free and available to all participants. We're particularly pleased today to have two other sponsors with us. Grantmakers in Health and Archstone Foundation are supporting this particular program. There are approximately 10 million people aged 65 and over living in rural America. And 1 out of 4 lives in the small town or a rural area. Transportation and access to service continues to be one of the top issues identified by aging services providers as a key to aging in place. In its November 2017 policy brief, the University of Minnesota Rural Health Research Center states, transportation has long been cited as a concern for rural residents, but is rarely the focus of health services research. We also know that transportation options in rural areas tend to be even more challenging than in urban areas. The bottom line, access to transportation is a rural imperative. Through our research in rural aging programs, we know that building strong partnerships is key to the development of sustainable programs. Today, we want to focus on what it takes to build effective partnerships and why philanthropic leadership is needed. We're extremely pleased to have 3 experts join us today to talk about these issues. Laura Mason is the Program Officer for Elders Programs area at the May and Stanley Smith Charitable Trust in San Francisco, California. Andrew Levac is the Senior Program Officer at the St. David's Foundation in Austin, Texas. He oversees the Foundation's strategies for aging in place. And Amy St. Peter is the Assistant Director of the Maricopa Association of Governments, the regional planning agency for the Greater Phoenix area. In this role, she coordinates diverse priorities and perspectives in the development of solutions that strengthen the vitality in one of the fastest growing regions of the country. I want to welcome you all. As it was previously mentioned, you can enter your questions in the question box that's on the panel to the right of your screen at any point, and I will be reading those to our speakers at the question and answer period. So with that, let's start with Laura.
Great. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon, depending on where you are. And thank you to John and the team at Grantmakers in Aging for putting this session together. I'd like to offer just a few general comments and share a little bit about what sparked the interest of the May and Stanley Smith Charitable Trust to get more involved in this issue area. The Smith Trust is a little unusual in that we are not only a place-based funder. We make grants across a large service area that includes 14 Western states, those shown here to the left of the blue line, as well as Alaska, Hawaii, and British Columbia, not shown here. And I wanted to include this slide in the deck for today as it was really an eye-opener for me. The green areas represent those that the U.S. Census considers to be rural, approximately 95% of the landmass of the country. And what is more, as John has noted before, you can stand in just about any major city in America and you are only 1 or 2 counties away from a rural area. So with that understanding that rural is not necessarily that far-flung distant place, I think it's really important. It may just be an hour away from where you sit. The Trust makes grants in 4 key issue areas: community engagement, aging in place, caregiving, and culture change in long-term care. We do both strategic and responsive grant making, and while we receive a large number of inquiries through our open LOI process, they are most often for services to elders in urban and suburban areas. So what brought us to this table? Ultimately, a desire to better position the Trust to be more responsive to needs across our entire service area, and really based on the understanding that transportation is always a top, if not the top social service need expressed by older adults. It's a foundational issue that is not only necessary for health and supporting aging in place, but also in terms of helping older adults connect with the people, places, and activities that make life meaningful for them. And finally, a desire to help convene a more modern conversation on this topic, one that takes into account some of the major developments in transportation over the last decade. For an example, ride sharing and on-demand ride services. So in order to do these things, we realized we needed to dig deeper and learn more and connect with a much broader audience. And to get us started on this journey, we've partnered with Grantmakers in Aging through the session at the 2017 conference in Boston, through today's webinar, and through the continued work and development of resources that will ultimately help funders and providers better meet the transportation needs of older adults. And with that, I will just add that if you are also working in the Western US or British Columbia, or have an interest in doing so, particularly around rural transportation, please reach out. Let's keep this conversation going.
Well, thank you very much, Laura. And you see Laura's contact information there, so please contact her if this is of interest to you. Let's turn to you, Andrew, and talk about some of the efforts in Central Texas.
Thanks, John. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be here today and to talk to you a little bit about the experience of St. David's Foundation in serving seniors and particularly working hard to address some challenges around transportation barriers that we have with folks as they age in place. Just a little bit about St. David's Foundation. We're a foundation focused on public health that works in a 5-county area in and around Austin, Texas. Basically, the foundation has an equity share in St. David's Healthcare, the largest hospital system in Austin, and we redistribute revenue from the hospital to this 5-county area that our hospitals serve. And we actually have 13 priority areas. I won't take you through all of them, but they range from access to primary care, to women's health, to access to healthy food, to addressing childhood adversity, to supporting seniors while aging in place. So pretty much a range of things that would hopefully make Austin the healthiest community in the nation. So I share this picture of Austin intentionally because while the vast majority of our investments happen in the Austin metropolitan area, we have a very complex, larger ecosystem in terms of the 5 counties that we serve. And so if we go to the next slide, I can talk a little bit about our work in our rural areas. So there are 4 contiguous counties to Austin, and those counties contain both suburban and rural areas within them. And so there's some long-holding historical rural towns and small agricultural areas in that work. But then there's also a dynamic of those rural communities being starting to have stress of having additional migration coming from Austin. We talk about, sadly, that Austin's greatest export is poverty, and as gentrification occurs in Austin and it becomes the sort of young, thriving microeconomy, there's a lot of stress being put on rural areas as people seek to have lower rents and an easier cost of living. So that's one dynamic that happens in our rural areas. But specifically, it's interesting to talk about these areas. The definition of these small towns that exist outside of Austin may not be defined in a federal agency or a state agency as rural, but they are rural. And the way that we often talk about that is if you're rural, you know it, and that there are some fundamental things about a rural community in terms of the lack of density and relative isolation that are unique to these communities. So I want to talk a little bit about our senior strategy on the next slide and talk about our work around aging in place. You can see our definition of what we're trying to address with an aging in place, and ultimately we're trying to allow seniors to live in their own home in a way that's safe, independent, comfortable, regardless of age, income, or ability level. And we have a very specific focus on our work around serving the most vulnerable seniors, which is highly relevant to seniors living in rural areas. We want to focus on low-income seniors, both Medicaid eligible and those just above the Medicaid eligibility threshold, who have particular vulnerabilities by not having any coverage through Medicaid. We're working particularly with seniors with some levels of cognitive or physical impairment, and particularly this opportunity to address social isolation, which is highly increased vulnerability when you do live in a rural area. Now, if you go to the next slide, you'll see that many of you will recognize this quote. It comes from, it's within Be in Mortar World, who Gawande is talking about when he was talking about decisions that he was making with his own father. And a provider told him, as he was trying to figure out this dance between providing care and autonomy, is that safety is what we want for the ones we love, but autonomy is what we want for ourselves. And so a lot of our work in aging in place is to really support that autonomy in ways that can be possible. And the research bears this out. On the next slide, you'll see that some research shows from AARP that nearly 90% of seniors want to stay in their own homes as they age. And even if they begin to need day-to-day assistance or ongoing health care during retirement, 82% would still prefer to stay in their homes. And our point is that transportation is a fundamental aspect of that autonomy, and even more important as we move into underserved areas, both in the suburban and rural landscape. And so to do that, the foundation has historically funded for over 10 years senior transportation programs, both within the city of Austin and outlying counties. And historically, the model that we've seen, and I'm going to talk about our historic focus and then talk to you about how some of these assumptions are changing and some of our investments are changing over time. But our historic focus is pretty much what you're looking at on this slide. Excuse me. It is the volunteer model. In Austin, there are actually 9 different organizations that have different chapters. One's called Drive a Senior, one is called Senior Access, one is Faith in Action. And they're all fundamentally in the same, in that they were started by local churches in specific neighborhoods to address the need to address transportation barriers for seniors. And they all kind of center around the idea of engaging volunteers to use their own vehicles to drive seniors from point to point to access medical appointments, groceries, congregate meal sites, senior centers, whatever the issue may be. And we still support that work. But there are a lot of challenges around supporting that work, both in our current work throughout our 5-county area, but particularly challenges that we face in more isolated rural areas. If you take a look at the next slide, there's a major issue that all these organizations are facing, which is a drop-off in the number of volunteers that have been able to provide this driving. And we've had a few dynamics of this, and as this article shows, we're not always sure what the answers are to why, but we have some evidence of what's driving this. For one case, we have an aging out of our volunteer base at a lot of these organizations, but also the structure of volunteerism is changing in Central Texas. A lot of our younger volunteers are interested in less structured commitments. I oftentimes mirror it to the gig economy, where people are sort of looking for very flexible options of engaging. So volunteerism still exists, but it doesn't exist necessarily in the same way of committing on Mondays from 4 to 7 to be available to give rides. Also, as I noted, churches typically were the organizing center of these volunteer-based models. And we know that churches are becoming less and less enrolled, and again, are tending to start to have an older distribution of congregates within their congregations. And then there's some other theories around diminished investment in nonprofits, making it harder to sort of foster and maintain a volunteer core. So one of our questions is, how do we respond to this challenge when what we're finding is an increased demand in even further outlying areas, and when we can't necessarily use the existing volunteer model to address a lot of that? So one of the things that we're looking at just within relying on volunteers is, are there opportunities for new technology to engage volunteers within this work? We've been looking at the foundation's been looking at different digital platforms that might be able to engage volunteers to make driving for seniors more easy. There's one platform that we're looking at called Spedsta, that's based out of San Diego, that basically is like an Uber for volunteers. If you can imagine a volunteer who may be interested in driving for seniors but may or may not be able to do it on a regular basis, they could enroll in this platform, and basically if they have their application on, if they're interested in driving, the app itself can tell if there's a senior in need nearby. They might be out at the grocery store, and on their way home they may be actually able to take a senior from one point to another point. They could get notifications as they drive into areas where there may be a need for a ride. So we think about technology in a lot of ways of self-driving cars and so forth, but also just technologies to engage volunteers are a critical opportunity as we start to really try to harness volunteers more, particularly in underserved areas. But if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about another evolution that's really happened within these organizations, and that is, as some of our organizations, particularly the ones who have moved out into some of our rural counties, have found that really what they've had to move from is a volunteer model to more of a classic nonprofit model of engaging in revenue generating opportunities and fundraising opportunities to provide services through vans. And that includes, raising money for the capital to actually have one of these specifically outfitted vans for seniors. There's kind of a range of these. This is a smaller one. There are even bigger sort of buses that can carry up to 16 seniors in a vehicle. And basically, the idea of these van routes is to basically identify seniors who have ongoing transportation needs for, again, a range of issues, everything particularly around addressing basic needs of getting to grocery stores, to a Walmart, to a senior center, and having different set routes throughout the week that allow to pick up these seniors. These organizations employ a driver. They have to be insured. But ultimately, the cost over the course of many rides can really drastically reduce the cost per client and per ride. And there's a double impact here, because as we start to provide these services, you're providing a basic need for transportation, but you're also fundamentally addressing the social isolation that rural seniors particularly experience in terms of not being able to be in contact with others. That the van routes themselves become an opportunity for fellowship and for support, and for riders on the vans to be able to check in on the well-being of each other that wouldn't otherwise be possible if they were isolated in their homes. Another model that the groups are moving to can be found on the next slide, and that is the idea of sort of working traditionally with taxis to provide point-to-point rides and paying for those and reimbursing those. And the revolution of ride-sharing apps has really made that cost per ride proposition much more feasible. What I'm showing you here is a platform from Lyft. That's a third-party platform that actually allows an organization like Drive a Senior or Senior Access be able to schedule rides for individuals, so that if there's a client who's interested in a ride, they can call a local nonprofit's center number. The person behind the phone can actually schedule the drive for that individual, and then simply through the phone relay the fact that a person named Steve in a white Prius will be picking them up in 3 minutes, and can ensure that that person has been able to pick them up on time. This has been incredibly effective in some of our outlying counties in terms of being able to get more reliable transportation. And there's sort of a mix here. In some cases, there have been places where we haven't been able to get a sort of a critical mass of Uber and Lyft rides, but other places we have been able to. And oftentimes what these organizations have done is started to really recruit drivers in these rural areas for their own income generation. So it's sort of a win-win. They're doing community development, encouraging people to be drivers, and then encouraging seniors to access this service by calling the nonprofit and having them schedule through Lyft or through Uber. Just a little bit more about, if you go to the next slide, you can find out another endeavor that we're doing. For some of you who've been in the ride-sharing news world, you may recall that about a year and a half ago, there was a rift between Uber and Lyft and the city of Austin. The city of Austin wanted FBI-level background checks for Uber and Lyft, and Uber and Lyft protested that and actually called for a ballot measure to ask the voters whether or not these background checks would be required. The voters upheld the city council's decision to have those rigorous background checks. And as a result, Uber and Lyft left. And when they did, the void that was left by that was a number of nonprofit rideshare companies that came into Austin, including the one that you'll see on your screen here, Ride Austin. And they basically came in and created similar technology. But by Ride Austin being a nonprofit, they were able to share more funds to the drivers themselves because they didn't have a profit motive. And they were also able to gear their services to be much more responsive to the needs of vulnerable populations. Ride Austin currently has a free ride program for members who access Travis County federally qualified health centers. And they're working with the St. David's Foundation on a new program that would, again, have a third-party application like the model I showed earlier with Lyft. But in this time, what they would be able to do is in that third-party application, actually pay drivers a higher rate for serving seniors when they're referred through a screening process on this phone. And what that would include is those drivers actually walking up to the home or residence where the senior is and giving them assistance in getting to and from the car. And for that, there would be a higher rate and some assurance from that. So again, we're working on that in Austin, but hopefully, as that model bears out in an urban area, we hope to then replicate it in an area like Bastrop, Texas, which is southeast of Austin. But the first thing that we would need to do is build up a drivership for Ride Austin that doesn't exist there now. I want to follow up with just a final slide, which sort of is an intentional metaphor here of the road forward in the rural area. And just to say that I've touched on a few things that we're working on, but there are many other new ideas around how to better serve highly isolated seniors in rural areas. Obviously, with the emerging technology of self-driving cars, there will be amazing new limitless opportunities about how to serve seniors through that technology. Through telehealth, there are opportunities to think of some of the challenges that have lack of transportation that can be addressed actually by technology. One of the things that the foundation is supporting is a depression screening tool and intervention that happens through telehealth measures with clients of Meals on Wheels in our 5-county area. And just the telehealth piece can oftentimes address some of the needs of social isolation without providing transportation to get a senior out of their home. And finally, I'll just come up with another idea that I heard from my colleagues at Generations United. They're a group who tries to find opportunities to bring seniors together with other generations, particularly younger youth, together to have a kind of reciprocal effect of how both groups can work with each other and benefit each other. And they have an example of a group in a fairly rural area where there's a high school that's doing driver's education. And what they found is that as they're doing their driving, they've been able to pick up seniors and take them from place to place. So they're not necessarily just driving around in a rural town, but they're actually having some utilities they learn how to drive. and they're doing similar work when kids have their learner's permits and driving with an adult, that they can actually do volunteerism while they're actually learning how to drive. So that's just, I think, an important example of the kind of limitless innovation that you can have when you start to try to address and solve some of these very challenging problems. So thank you so much for your time, and I'll now pass it along to John again.
Well, thanks so much, Andrew. And you see the contact information for him, and I know that if you have specific questions about any of our speakers and want to address it to them directly, these are the ways you can contact them. So Amy, let's turn to you and learn about some of the innovations that are taking place in the rural area around Phoenix.
Excellent, John. Thank you so much. I work with the Maricopa Association of Governments. We're a regional planning agency, and our service area is more than 10,000 square miles. We have a wide range of communities that we work with, ranging from the big city of Phoenix, one of the largest in the country, to a small town called Wickenburg, which is adamantly and proudly rural. Our network serves the entire state, particularly in the area of transportation, as well as a number of other related areas, through a strength-based approach. We're thankful to Grantmakers in Aging, Grantmakers in Health, the Piper Trust, and all of our partners for their support of this work. And thank you so much to everyone joining the webinar today for the work that you do or will do to connect people through transportation. Without transportation, nothing else matters. It is the way that people connect and participate in their communities. In this photo on your screen, there are people enjoying each other, dancing, talking, breaking the social isolation that can cripple. Everyone arrived thanks to having transportation options in this rural community. The idea of focusing on transportation has arrived as well. Now more than ever before, we're focused on transportation as a means, not an end. The mode, whether it be car, bus, trail, or train, doesn't matter as much as the access, and rural communities need more access. Next slide, please. This is the why. Access to transportation makes people's lives better. This letter was written by a woman living in the rural community of Wickenburg, and thanks for Freedom Express, which I'll talk about a bit more in just a moment. This access means that people can get food, medicine, and time with loved ones. These are not abstract metrics. This is what people need to live. Transportation provides that lifeline. In each of our communities, we dedicate ourselves to the why. There are very real challenges, whether they be tangible or perceived. Working through these challenges is necessary, and it is worth it. Next slide, please. Early in my career, I worked in the rural mountains of Virginia. I was literally a Yankee, being from Connecticut, and not used to the culture, although I came to cherish and absolutely respect it. One of the more jarring experiences, though, was hearing people say over and over again, "You can't get there from here." This was a geographic and physical challenge. It was also, unfortunately, an entrenched mindset. This refrain is heard in all kinds of communities throughout the country. We do well to acknowledge it, to honor the frustration that shades it, and then to work tirelessly to move beyond it in partnership with the community. By relentlessly collaborating, we can get there from here. Next slide, please. This is how we got here from there. In partnership with local foundations such as the Piper Trust and national partners like Grantmakers in Aging, we formed the Arizona Age-Friendly Network, a network of governments, nonprofits, and philanthropy. We are dedicated to making our communities better places to live for older adults and for all generations. We are currently partnering with 8 communities, with 2 more under development, to implement age-friendly programs and strategies. Our communities are providing rides, launching villages and time banks, and embedding age-friendly principles in the community's general plans. In rural and urban areas, we are connecting older adults because we are connecting to each other. Next slide, please. This is why a collaborative approach is so critical. One system simply cannot meet this need. The demand and scope extends beyond any one sector. In short, we need each other. Increasing numbers of people and decreasing funding means we have to redefine solutions. We love our cars, but that can't be the only solution forever. Especially in rural areas, walking may not be a viable solution due to the limited infrastructure and expansive geographic areas. Carpooling works, but only if you have people available and willing to drive. Transit options are typically limited, and paratransit is expensive. All of these options are solutions in some cases, but not all. New options like ride-sharing, as Andrew mentioned, are opening up new possibilities and pioneering new approaches. As we partner beyond our systems, we need to be aware of differences in meaning and culture. For example, just last week at our Age-Friendly Network meeting, a local government human services staff were talking about the need for more shade structures at bus stops. A representative from the transportation sector referred them to their local NPO and offered tips. A local healthcare representative cut in and asked, "What is an NPO?" Because in his world, that means do not feed by mouth. An NPO is a metropolitan planning organization. MAG is an NPO, and we organize transportation planning throughout our service area. So you can see that as one person thinks they're talking about transportation, the other one is wondering, why can't I eat that by mouth? One person is saying what another person is not hearing in some cases. Next slide, please. We continue to work towards having a shared understanding. Throughout the past 6 years as a network, this shared understanding has resulted in a number of accomplishments. These are just some of those results. Freedom Express was developed as a brand new volunteer transportation service created 3 years ago in Wickenburg, Arizona. Through a carefully crafted and well-maintained partnership, they have provided more than 19,000 rides just in those 3 years to older adults in a very rural area. This is a partnership among the town government, nonprofits, and philanthropy. We also have the Transportation Ambassador Program that provides training, information, and resources about transportation to people in all different sectors, in formal networks as well as informal networks. An interactive inventory of transportation providers makes this information available 24/7. Every community knows their challenges all too keenly. The answers and solutions to these challenges are to be found within each community. Philanthropy can play an important role in convening people who can help to uncover and to sustain these solutions. Next slide, please. This is what we have learned during our journey. People are ready for the solutions that we can help them to create, and ideally, the people themselves will be part of that solution. Because people are the heart of this work, it is critical to honor their timeline, even if it's different from our expectations. They may want to move more urgently and cut through a lot of red tape quickly. They also may need to slow down to let an idea ripen. We need to be there when they're ready. We need to take concrete steps toward even a small win, because it will generate the energy needed to tackle those really big, complex problems. In developing these partnerships, we can look for who is hurt or helped by these issues and form partnerships with them. Next slide, please. The focus that we choose will define how we measure success, what we consider to be results, and how we message those results. It will also define what kind of partnerships we build, who our partners are, and what is the impact of these partnerships. All too often, society frames older adults in the triangle to the left. Older adults, though, and hopefully ourselves, we see older adults in the painting on the right. The Arizona Age-Friendly Network held an art show statewide, and we invited people to visually depict how they saw their lives when they were an older adult, whether that's 65, 75, 85, 95. Shirley Cunningham, age 75 at the time, was a winner of that art show, and her painting is before you on the screen. The name of it is Forest Primeval. These are her words. Where am I in my life right now? In my 70s, I walk in the forest primeval, an unknown land of beauty and mystery. Each day, new sunrises and sunsets, unexpected shafts of light falling through the forest canopy above, illuminating my path. This is old growth, mature ancient forest that has withstood significant disturbance. I value its resilience when storms swirl around me and shadows fall. This unknown land has a mystic quality, wonder, and new vistas. I find joy and, yes, bravery in my heart as I walk step by step each day, for the first time in this primeval wood. I invite everyone on this webinar today and moving forward to venture into these woods in a spirit of discovery and courage for the path ahead. Next slide, please. Thank you for your time today and for all that you do every day to make our communities and the lives of older adults better. Please do reach out with your questions and your ideas. I look forward to learning and continuing this dialogue with you. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Amy, and thanks to all of our speakers. And I do want to now turn to some of the questions that you have sent in, and at this point you can also continue to write in your questions. We have quite a number, and we'll go directly to those then. And I think I'll start with a question to Laura, and then have Andrew chime in if you would. But this is a question about, in some ways, the motivation and what you see as the opportunity as a charitable grant-making foundation to be involved in this work. Is there something particularly compelling about the rural aspect of this that you think makes it a good fit for foundation work? Laura?
Sure, thanks, John. You know, the transition to no longer driving for an older adult is incredibly difficult no matter where you live. But for folks in rural areas, it's particularly difficult for many of the same reasons Amy mentioned. Their public transit infrastructure is not the same. Places aren't walkable. So I feel like the rural imperative here it's just ripe for foundation involvement to support planning and creative solutions. It seems transportation is an even more pressing issue for these rural areas. And so to the extent that we can help support local planning processes, seed pilot programs, help with evaluation, sustainability, that these are all you know, areas where foundations can have a big impact, working with local partners, that is.
Thanks, Laura.
Andrew, anything to add?
Yeah, I'm happy to add something. You know, as I mentioned, for our foundation, we work in this 5-county area, and you know, our goal is to make it the healthiest community in the nation. And to do that, we've looked a lot at disparities around all the issues that we've addressed. And you know, over time and over and over again, we find that we have the largest health disparities in these rural outlying areas of Central Texas. And so we've in our most recent strategic plan had a very intentional effort to move out and serve the more rural, isolated areas. And we had to be intentional about it because, you know, quite frankly, it's really easy to stay here in Travis County. We have a lot of capacity here. We've got great nonprofits to do really important work, and it's a lot harder to go out and to, as the foundation, as representatives, to go out and create trust and relationships and address some really hard pressing needs. We had to put it in our plan to make us do it, because I think otherwise it would just be easier to grab the low-hanging fruit that is here within Travis County. I think the other thing that we noticed as we started working in these rural areas is just how transportation over and over again came right up at the #1 or #2 issue that they were facing. And the other issue they were facing was access to care, which is inextricably linked to transportation. So the stark difference between the needs of rural communities and folks within Travis County, and the difference, particularly as it was related to transportation, was evident immediately. So that really helped motivate us.
Thanks so much. Amy, let's return to you with a question about trust. And I think this touches on the issue that you raised in terms of, you know, there's some people and organizations that may be helped by new efforts. There may be some that are harmed. Could you talk a little bit about what you did in Wickenburg, for example, as a way to build trust over time with the service providers that were already out there?
Absolutely. Thank you, John. I think trust is an area where rural communities really have the advantage sometimes. The communities can be more tight-knit. This can contribute to higher levels of trust. They also have a long history together, and so they know each other very often. They also are very self-reliant. So all of these qualities really can be leveraged. When we started working with our partners in Wickenburg, they were very innovative, very creative about getting the word out. Our community engagement included sending out an informal kind of outreach survey, and it went out through the water bill because the town had control over that, and they can make that happen very quickly as well as very inexpensively. In terms of building trust among the traditional providers, so people who've been doing this work in aging for a long time, playing very important roles in the community. It meant that we engaged them early, often, and continuously. Some people, honestly, were coming to our meetings because they just wanted to see what we were doing. They didn't necessarily have a lot of trust in us. And I think it's important to acknowledge where that's coming from. It's coming from a very well-intentioned place of wanting to preserve their funding. And it's very easy and sometimes very real to view the situation as, well, there's only so much funding. And if somebody new is coming in, then they could take my funding, my volunteers, the attention. Instead, what we found by frequent communication, really striving at all times to see all of the different perspectives and honoring those different perspectives, we've been able to demonstrate through our actions, not just through our words, that we can really help everybody, and that it's not necessarily one bucket of funding. It could be more. We can grow that bucket, for example. And so it's happened that when I talk about our work, I talk about our providers that have been doing this work for a long time. I talk about our new pilot sites that have just been engaged for 3 years or less. And each of them over the years has been able to receive funding because of that exposure. And so the Age Friendly Network really helps to amplify and not compete with the traditional funders and with the traditional providers. And so everyone benefits from it, but we have to remain very vigilant and understand where people are coming from.
Thanks. That's very helpful. Andrew, I'm going to turn back to you, and I'm going to combine several questions around sort of the Lyft Ubers of the world. One is a question about, could you talk about it at a basic level, what those services provide, why they're called ride sharing, and so forth. But then another question around how can these be used in places where the digital divide may be very strong. So you're in a mountainous region and there's no cell service, for example, or there's no internet service. And so the basic notion of like an Uber thing is that you get out your cell phone and you pull it up and you watch the driver drive over to your house. And in places where that's not available, what would you do?
Great questions. Thanks, John, and thanks to everyone who asked. So yeah, I don't know if I'm the best person to give a great definition of ride sharing, but these are, this is sort of a new platform of technology that allows people to, with their cell phone, use GPS mapping to basically identify. They can, through GPS mapping, it can mark where they are, or they can identify a place where they want to be picked up by manually entering it in. And then through cellular technology, people who are willing to actually drive that person, oftentimes for a fee, can be paired with the person who desires that ride. And so, Uber and Lyft and Ride Austin are all examples of rideshare companies who have harnessed this technology to basically meet drivers and riders together. And it's been monetized for the most part through Uber and Lyft. And as I mentioned, programs like Spedsta are actually probably a better definition of ride sharing, where you're actually engaging volunteers who are out there to actually identify a person who needs a ride through an app on their phone, can drive to them, pick them up, and drive them to where they want to go. I think it's a great question about sort of the use of this technology in far outlying remote areas. I think there's a couple things there. I think it is a fair point that in the most remote of areas, you're not going to be able to have, a person necessarily use, if you don't have cell service, you probably can't identify where that person is and how to meet them. But there is the ability to still use these platforms offline. If you go back and think about that slide I had with the Lyft map, you could still basically use the mapping to basically tell someone where you are, call a landline, a central office, and that person could then reach out to people who, if they have access to technology where they are, you could locate them and tell them how to get to the place that's remote, that's out of service. Or you could simply have a cadre of people and schedule rides through these platforms by calling the drivers, the volunteer drivers. So you could still use some of these platforms to schedule rides, to plan rides, even if the technology wasn't there. So I think that's a fair point around extreme barriers in the most remote areas. And then I think the other piece is, the other barrier is just the use of the technology. And again, I think that's where the third-party platform can come in. If a person is not comfortable using a cellular device or doesn't have a cellular device, if you can call a third party via a telephone landline, they can use that technology for you and match you up with those services.
Thanks. And we had a couple people write in. So tell us what SPESDA is, or spell it for us, or is there a reference to it? Because you used the term a couple times, and I'm not familiar with it either. So
yeah, so this is just some work that I've been doing. It really came up. It's funny because we were interested and we started asking ourselves, wow, is there any is there any way we could create a platform for volunteers to use something similar to Uber? And through a Google search, we found that there is at least one company in San Diego called SPEDSTA. It's SPEDSTA, and spedsta.com, and they have one technology platform that allows you to basically engage volunteers through this site. We have not tested this technology yet, so it's just one example. I would encourage folks, if they're interested in that model, to look at others. So we're going to look at the feasibility of if this platform is one that is user-friendly or not. There are certainly others, and the other option for us would be, could we build a platform? They actually, the technology is there so much that it actually doesn't take too much, believe it or not, to create your own platform and designing these things to allow you to use the cellular GPS technology to schedule rides.
Laura, I'm going to come back to you. You're out in the center of the tech universe out in the San Francisco Bay Area. And obviously, you also have worked a lot on transportation area in rural areas around not only that part, but the western part of the United States. So this question is about other kinds of technology that we are seeing coming on, particularly autonomous vehicles or driverless cars, as they're usually thought of. And now, of course, Toyota and others are introducing driverless buses and all sorts of different things. So are you seeing that people in the technology world are moving forward in these? Do you think that there is a opportunity for the rural world to get involved in this particular area of technology development?
Well, that's a really interesting question, and I do think there is tremendous opportunity with autonomous vehicles, and I think it's just a matter of how long will it take to get comfortable, and I think, that's exactly what it is. There are going to be some pretty serious cultural issues with adopting this particular technology. It's, I think, going to be, it's a higher stakes game than getting used to your iPhone, right? So you're getting into a car without a driver. So it's going to be very hard for people, I think, especially older adults, to accept this as a strategy. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how that unfolds.
Thanks around that. Amy, let's come back to you for a moment. We've talked a lot, and usually when we have these conversations around transportation, what we're talking about is moving people from one place to another to receive what they need to receive. But of course, there's another phenomena going on right now, which is basically what some people call the Amazonation of the country, where you can now call Amazon or go online and have them deliver essentially anything to you in any part of the country within a day, sometimes within hours. Do you see that as an important part of this mix in rural transportation as we think about it broadly? Or is that simply going to mean that we're going to be even more isolated than we have been in the past?
I think there's a balance to be had there. It is ironic that with technology evolving to the point of keeping us so well connected virtually, that so many people, older adults as well as any generation, they're feeling more and more isolated in terms of that face-to-face. And I think it's raising the awareness that technology is a tool, and you have to be careful with how you use that tool. So for example, one solution that we're finding works very well in our rural communities, particularly with the ones that have great geographic distances between, is utilizing FedEx to deliver food boxes. It requires some specialized training, some specialized equipment to make sure that the food keeps over those great distances. But particularly in terms of the training, it's reinforcing that it's not just delivering that meal or that food box, it's also doing a wellness check and teaching them the empathy, teaching them what to look for to engage with people so they have that person-to-person contact. So transportation and technology can absolutely help, but we just need to be mindful in terms of how we're using it.
Thanks. Andrew or Laura, any comments on that particular issue?
Oh, just to echo, Amy's sentiment about it doesn't address the social isolation, but yes, it is a tool, very much so, and one that is important in addressing some of those unmet needs. Absolutely.
All right. One of the questions that always comes up in transportation programs, particularly volunteer ones, is not only the decrease in volunteers, as Andrew talked about, but also issues like insurance and payment for, for gasoline and other kinds of expenses and so forth. Do you see any new innovations around those issues in terms of helping people that want to volunteer be able to do so more effectively? And I'll send that to anybody that wants to respond.
I feel like I probably should. Oh, go ahead. Go ahead, please, Amy.
You're far too eager to pass that.
Yeah.
Hi, it's Amy. We've seen success with people starting to kind of band together. So talking about agencies approaching insurance companies that they might have in common and leverage each other's business with that insurance company. We've seen that work. We've also seen it work when they partner together to take a look at their releases, their training, things like that. Because sometimes if you can check the boxes together, then that helps the insurance company to feel more comfortable with it. And also sometimes just kind of outsourcing. Andrew was talking about using Lyft. One of our partners, Northwest Valley Connect, is starting to use Lyft for their trips that don't require a wheelchair accessible vehicle. So they shift kind of that insurance need on to Lyft for those rides. And if the person needs a wheelchair accessible vehicle, then they are providing that ride themselves directly. They're partnering with their local communities in rural areas, and they're actually contracting with the community to provide that service, because Northwest Valley Connect will actually book the trip for them. So the person requesting the ride doesn't need to have a cell phone or a smartphone, for example. So I think kind of that coalition approach for insurance has had some success, and engaging other partners who maybe aren't faced with those same challenges has been successful as well.
Andrew, anything to add?
No, Amy saved me. Thank you.
Well, we have a lot of other questions, and I do want to remind our audience that our three speakers are very generous with trying to respond to your questions directly. And so if you didn't catch their emails, we will be repeating this program through our website in the next few days. So so we'll be looking forward to that. But at this point, I'd like to turn to our speakers one last time and ask each of them to give us their final words of wisdom on this important topic. Laura, let's start with you.
Sure, thanks, John. Well, really just underscoring a couple of major themes that came up in today's conversation. One about cross-sector collaboration, particularly in rural areas where there may be fewer organizations and services. It's going to be important to leverage what organizations and efforts are already in play. And so getting those local conversations started, whatever shape they may take in different areas. And second, really just this understanding about transportation and health being so directly linked. And I just hope that as colleagues, that we can all help define the conversation in that way. I think it's very fitting that Grantmakers in Health is sponsoring this call in part today. So, and then finally, just in closing, I would say that the Trust is actively seeking partners to promote innovation and come up with creative solutions. So the offer to be in touch is very genuine. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Andrew?
Thanks, everyone. First of all, I just want to thank everyone for spending some time with us today. I've enjoyed having the opportunity to talk, and I think my final thoughts are that, you know, I would encourage folks, if my experience has said anything, it's that, you know, I'm not a transportation expert, but when we found this need, we started to just dig around and try to figure out what was possible, what assets existed. And when I was really struggling trying to figure out how we could address this need, I kind of went back to some of my old public health teaching, which was this book by Jonathan Kretzmann called Building Communities from the Inside Out. And it's a very simple concept of looking at instead of looking at what the deficits are in a community, what are the assets? And I think for each of the rural towns that we've been working in, it's simply a matter of, you know, what are the assets in terms of organizations, individuals, community leaders, and then in some cases it has been, you know, the technology as well. What are the things that we can build on there? And then just start, you know, tinkering around and seeing what's possible. And I encourage everyone to work and try to find some opportunities, because they do exist.
Thanks so much. Amy?
Thank you, John. I think the main thing that I want to leave people with is that we need you. We need everyone at the table, because transportation and how we deliver transportation is changing so radically, sometimes from one day to the next. From the transportation world, we typically develop plans on a 20-year horizon. Things are changing within 20 days, 20 weeks. I mean, things are changing at such a rapid pace that we've just never seen before. Typically, we're planning for the first mile, last mile. That means, how do people travel from their home to the 1 mile to the bus stop? And then how do they travel from their destination bus stop to where they're ultimately going to? But today, particularly with autonomous vehicles, for example, we're looking at first feet, last 50 feet. And so it's great to have the autonomous vehicle, but if you're visually impaired, how do you get to the car? How do you travel over that 50 feet to get to the car in the first place? So our world is radically changing, and we need your help. We need your partnership to figure out what that will look like and how we can improve what it looks like for older adults. And the final thought is to be brave and clunky. A colleague of mine would recommend that we just be brave and clunky. It takes both. It takes being brave to have those conversations that maybe people typically shy away from. And sometimes it's clunky, it's messy, but it's worth it all the same. And so I encourage everyone to be both brave and clunky.
Good words. I like brave and clunky because it is often a messy process to do the wonderful community development you're talking about. I want to particularly alert our audience today that through the generous support of the May and Stanley Smith Charitable Trust and the St. David's Foundation, Grantmakers in Aging will be producing 2 new resource books on transportation for older persons in rural areas. Both of these will be available sometime probably in March or April, and one of them will focus on funders and what philanthropy can do in this area. The other will be a much more general reference on the different tools going on. So please let us know at our website, giaging.org, if this is of interest to you. So I want to end today by thanking Laura Mason, Andrew Levac, and Amy St. Peter for the wonderful insights today and for all the great work that they and all of you do to improve the lives of older persons and people of all ages. I also want to thank the Archstone Foundation and Grantmakers in Health for their support of today's program, and the John A. Hartford Foundation for their support of this entire series. I would be remiss if I did not also thank Jean Anthony and Cindy Padilla, who helped develop this particular webinar. This presentation will be available to anyone who wishes to view it later, including both the slides and the audio. Just look for the rebroadcast link on our website at Grantmakers in Aging. And finally, we have a special webinar coming up on February the 16th at 2:30 Eastern Time, which is a celebration of 5 years of our Conversations with GIA series, which has been supported from the beginning by the John A. Hartford Foundation. Dr. Atul Gawande, who was quoted earlier, who's perhaps the best known medical writer in the country right now, and also a surgeon himself and a public health researcher, will be joining us for that hour-long webinar. So please spread the word. This is, once again, because of the support of the John A. Hartford Foundation, free and available to anyone, but we have to have you register ahead of time. So for this and any other thing, go to our website. And I finally want to thank all of you for the great work that you do and for joining us today. Have a great day.